New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Emmy Vadnais, co-host with Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring how Sasquatch is a paranormal primate with my guest, Christopher Noel, who holds a master's degree in philosophy from Yale University and a master's in fine arts from Vermont College of Fine Arts, where he taught for 20 years. He researches the phenomenon of Sasquatch and is the filmmaker of the documentary film How to See a Sasquatch. Christopher is author of several books, including There Is No Veil, At Play in the Vast Here and Now, UAPs and the Afterlife, How New Disclosures Support Centuries of Psychic and Spiritual Research, Mind Speak, Tapping into Sasquatch and Science, and Sasquatch and Autism, 12 Parallels. This is Christopher's third interview with New Thinking Aloud. If you enjoy this program, please like, subscribe, press the bell icon, and share. Christopher is joining us from Montpelier, Vermont. Now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Chris. I am so happy to have you back with me on New Thinking Aloud today.
Thank you, Emmy. Very happy to be here, as always.
You've been interviewed 2 previous times on New Thinking Aloud where we talked about how there is no veil, and we also talked about UAPs and the afterlife. And today we're going to go into, I know, a topic that's very near and dear to you, Sasquatch, and how you suggest that Sasquatch is very real and is also a paranormal primate. To get us started, how do you know Sasquatch is real, and how did you become interested and so passionate about this topic?
Well, ever since I was 11 years old and first saw the Patterson-Gimlin film in a movie theater, they had it as a little clip in front of the movie. I was captivated. My imagination was captivated by this figure walking across the sand in this valley in Northern California, and I could tell, at least in my undeveloped critical analysis, I could tell that this wasn't a person in a suit. And in the 50-some years since then, I've seen many analyses, and they only get more and more substantive as our ability to draw out details from the 16-millimeter film improves and improves. And this certain analyst, the leading analyst in this field, is M.K. Davis. And anyone who doesn't know about his work, just search him on YouTube, and you can start seeing his analysis videos that do granular work at observing the muscle groups and the kind of biomechanics, et cetera, that this figure in the Patterson film, who goes affectionately by Patty, employs. And I spent so long on this just because, in terms of knowing the species is real, some people think it's just one Bigfoot. I call it Sasquatch because that's the Native American sort of long-standing name similar to Sasquatch. And Bigfoot is more of a sort of just like a tabloid, kind of a cheaper term, just because they have big feet, but they're huge, so their feet aren't disproportionately big, but it doesn't work to call them disproportionate foot. So people just call it Bigfoot. But anyway, I think that if the figure in the Patterson film is real, then it stands to reason that all the tens of thousands of eyewitness accounts of people seeing and interacting with this same species are mostly also legitimate, because it's a real species, and people aren't going to, every single one of those tens of thousands of accounts is not going to be a misidentification or a hoax or something like that, And so if you can pinpoint the reality, the irrefutable authenticity of the Patterson film, then that right there is enough to know that they're real. And then there's tons of other evidence. But before leaving the Patterson film, if you're interested, I have a video on my channel, Impossible Visits. The video is called The Patterson Film, All You Need to Know to Be 100% Convinced. So take a look at that if you're interested, if you're on the fence. But then over the years, I continued to learn more and more about the species and the nature of the habitat that it seems to live in, to occupy, and then learned that there are track casts. Tracks don't make themselves, and people find very, very similar tracks, both huge ones, like 20 inches, and small baby ones, in the middle of nowhere, all the way from British Columbia down to Florida, in places, and of course around the world too, but we don't even have to get into that because it's enough right here in North America. People find these tracks and they have an extremely consistent suite of morphological characteristics. They have a mid-tarsal hinge, it's called. The feet bend in the middle like the great apes, chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans. Their feet bend like this. But Sasquatch have 5 front-facing toes, unlike those other higher primates and like us. And the more you look into it, the more this species, this organism seems to be a cross between Homo sapiens and the other higher primates that have a lot of differences from us. Sasquatch seems to stand right in the middle on all sorts of measures. So I learned about tracks and how there are thousands and thousands of track casts that have been taken all across North America and how similar they all are and how many of them were stumbled upon in the middle, like by loggers in the middle of the forest. Nobody knew where the logging operation was going to go. And so there was no reason for some hoaxer to sneak in 12 miles into the timberland and lay down a pretend print. And especially without the very likely lacking the anatomical knowledge to match up this print with those that have been taken, down in North Carolina or Georgia or Vermont or Arizona. And all these prints, unless they're fakes, in which case they look very different, all the authentic prints are extremely close dead ringers for one another. So this is another reason. There are many, many reasons why I came to believe that the species was real. For want of a better word, they're real, just as real as a squirrel. I didn't know there was any way to systematically study the species. I thought you had to just be struck by lightning with good fortune of driving at 2 a.m. down a lonely road and seeing one walk in front of you, And it wasn't until 2005 that I learned that there were expeditions open to the public led by this organization called the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, or BFRO. Now, a lot of people have a lot of different opinions on the BFRO, and I don't need to go into all those. Suffice it to say that this organization is filled with dedicated, open-minded, critically thinking individuals who just want to find evidence. So these expeditions go to places with a long history of sightings, dating back decades, even centuries, with Native American sightings and early European sightings. And on these expeditions, you go to these places and you go out in the middle of the night and you start to make sounds that Sasquatch also makes and sometimes responds to, like wood knocks. You knock against a tree, and most of the time you don't hear anything back, but sometimes from a ridge, like a mile and a half up above you and away, you hear like a response. And this happens throughout North America too. People make fun of wood knocking, but it's a way to just register whether there are members of a local Sasquatch group nearby who are in the mood to play or in the mood to interact, because they do seemingly love to interact with our species. I think because of the close kinship between our species. So I went around with those guys. I went to 12 different expeditions in Florida and Arizona and Northern California and Pennsylvania, et cetera. And in talking to the people on these trips, I learned that there was a better way. Ironically, on these expeditions, I learned there was a better way than expeditions to go about learning about the species. There's like a royal road to learning about them, which is so-called habituation sites. And habituation in the sense that we use it with Jane Goodall or Dian Fossey, where they are studying a group of great apes, and Sasquatch is a great ape, so are we. That's the family Hominidae. These field researchers, Dian Fossey and Jane Goodall, would habituate their local primate groups. And that just means to become familiar with their ways, to become less afraid of them, and through repetition, month after month and year after year, to allow the fellow primates in the different species to become less apprehensive about the human presence and to become more relaxed and to go about their business in a natural way that's not overly influenced by being observed and having, film taken of you and notes taken of you. Well, in the case of Sasquatch, they don't let themselves be filmed. They do often let themselves be tape recorded. So I started in 2008 to become friends on the newly burgeoning internet with a group of people, mostly down south, who lived at these habituation sites, as they came to be called. And I learned how consistently they were getting interaction with their local Sasquatch group, the members of which almost always only at night would come and slap the side of their house, would throw pebbles onto their roof, and you could hear the pebbles landing on the roof when there's no trees and no nuts falling or pine cones from above. Pebbles would land and bounce down the roof. Sometimes a Sasquatch would tap on the window, little subtlety, and you'd look up. Sometimes a child in the house. They're very drawn to children, as we all are. They're fascinating and adorable and fun to watch. And so these Sasquatch would tap on the window, and the kid would look up and see a big face in the window, completely freak out. That's happened hundreds and thousands of times in the annals of habituation sites. So I came into contact with lots of people who were living at these places, some of whom hated the idea that they had Sasquatch constantly besieging them. One woman in Texas thought of herself as being under siege by these creatures and called the local Texas game warden and wanted them to come and just pack the Sasquatch up into a truck and take him off. It doesn't work that way. So, but some of the people are as fascinated as I was about learning how these they're our next of kin on Earth, and some people are very alive and attuned to that fact and want nothing more than to become more and more conversant with how they are and to become closer, more able to communicate with them.
What does the word Sasquatch mean?
At least 90+% of North American First Nations, indigenous peoples had a word for Sasquatch stretching back into the, beyond when we can document historically in writing. They have words for the same species. And these words mean variously big brother, hairy man, man of the woods, sometimes people of the earth, sometimes first people. And Sasquatch literally means hairy man in the language of, and I forget the name of the group, in British Columbia. And it's not an exact match for what their word was. It's a transliteration, but it's the closest we can come to an authentic name. This one habituation site that I visited several times back in the day when I was first starting out this research, and that was in East Texas, and I had a thermal camera, and one night the woman of the house who had seen them over the years, mostly at night in the moonlight, but sometimes in the daytime. And so she and I and her daughter and her daughter's friend were having a huge bonfire, roasting marshmallows and hot dogs. And every now and then I would walk out of the firelight, out of the circle of light, and scan the wood line. Because one thing that's known about Sasquatch behavior is that they love to spy on people when we're going about our business, especially at campfires. And I think perhaps they know that when we're looking at campfires, we're kind of blind because our eyes are attuned to the campfire. And so they feel more relaxed, confident about coming closer. So I would go out of the firelight and scan the tree line, and I saw a horizontal bar of light, which in thermal camera context is heat. But I kicked myself ever since, and this has been 15 years. I didn't recognize it as potentially related to what I was looking for, because I was looking for some enormous thing standing up, peeking out from behind a tree or swaying back and forth as they like to do. And it's a horizontal sort of bar, and I thought, well, maybe it's a metal bar or a rock that has retained heat from the day. And I didn't notice until I got back home to Vermont and looked at the footage that at the end of this horizontal thing is a hand, and it's going like this around a board in a lumber pile. So on YouTube, I have that. You can look at it. It's called Woodpile Sasquatch. And again, it's on my channel, Impossible Visits. And so I got this thermal footage to confirm the fact that, yes, this woman wasn't crazy, and I didn't think she was crazy, but there was a Sasquatch spying on us. Back in Vermont, I asked her, will you go out and measure how far we were from this spot? And it's 35 feet from the campfire. And so it was super close. And of course, if I had my wits about me and realized that they might be crouching down, and they often are, and in the video, you can see it's too bright, hotter than the rest of the flesh, eyes looking out through a little opening in the woodpile. And if I realized it at the time, I would have approached and would have gotten fantastic footage. But as it is, I've been told, and I think it's one of the best thermal footage examples of Sasquatch. In the 2000 teens, when thermal camera technology became more and more affordable, we all thought, well, this is going to blow the lid off the situation. We'll be able now to just go out and look around and see them. Turns out they hide even in the dark, or they know somehow intuitively that we are using cameras, even though it's dark. Maybe they can see so well in the dark that they see us using a camera, but they just hide. They just hide instinctively, intuitively. That's their nature. One of the names, speaking of names, in Oregon, a Native American tribe or group has a name that in their language means to hide behind. The entire nature of this creature is to hide behind, but also to peek out. So, it's not a challenge that can be simply overcome, to just be with these people. They're a type of people in the way that anthropologists can be with cultures or societies that we can get permission to embed with. There's no embedding with Sasquatch groups. So the next best thing is to do audio recordings.
You have spent hundreds of hours essentially doing your own, shall we say, field research, where you've gone out into the woods, spent the night fearlessly, it seems. How would you describe their behavior, and what is the connection to, some people might put them in the category as a cryptid or a shapeshifter? What is the connection to some of that phenomenon?
I came up with a sort of a methodology, which is to go out in the woods, even small forests, even close to civilization. Because one thing I learned over the years, and that other researchers are increasingly learning as well, not from me, but through their own research, is that surprisingly, startlingly, this species, or at least certain members of the species, spend time right on the boundaries of our civilization rather than out in the wilderness. They have all the wilderness they need, hundreds of millions of acres of undeveloped forest in America and 1 billion undeveloped acres in Canada. So if they wanted to remain incognito or not even pursued in terms of research, but just kind of existing in this liminal space of folklore, they could easily stay farther, much farther than us. But I have gone out, and many have gone out in their local forests. I've done most of my research right here in central Vermont, next to a small city, and I have filmed them, and I have recorded their voices and their other behaviors on many occasions. Filmed them just once. So I've realized this because of finding their structures. So all higher primates, including, of course, us, manipulate their environment. And I'm sure you're familiar with gorillas and chimpanzees and how they make nests. They break branches and other natural structures. They alter it to show where the hunting party is gone so the rest of them can go. Like they use their environment to make meaning and to make objects, to change over the environment into something that's more recognizable and familiar to them so that they feel at home. And I think Sasquatch is no different. And what they use are large-scale objects, often, like whole trees. They will, carry one tree. You can tell it's been carried from somewhere else because it'll be placed up inside of another tree, like horizontally, and just up there floating, and the big root balls at one end, and all the branches are at the other, and then it's inside of another tree. And there's no way that's going to happen naturally. And all sorts of more subtle things, like little teepee structures that aren't the same as shelters that Boy Scouts or that people make. Bushcraft. Some of them are bushcraft. Sometimes you can't tell, but sometimes they'll be 200 yards from here, there is a tree, and 25 feet up in it, there are 50 branches broken off at their end, all wedged in to a crook in the tree. And there's no practical purpose for this. And you'd have to get a ladder to do that if you were one of us. But somebody in the local Sasquatch group apparently gathered all these, broke them, climbed up the tree, and shoved them in there. There's lots of wedging and spearing of things through clefts and trees. And anyway, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of Sasquatch stick and tree structures. And I have a book called A Field Guide to Sasquatch Structures, if you're interested. It didn't exist, and I figured somebody's got to make this book, so I finally did. What my method became was to go in the woods, either deeper, a few miles in the woods, or right at the outskirts of this town that I live in, find these structures that were suspicious, possibly Sasquatch, and then leave audio recorders out there. And I have these recorders that can be programmed to just record during the night, and then the next night, so you can get many nights in succession without having to come back and collect it. And then you have to listen in real time, because just looking at the spectrogram isn't enough, because some subtle sounds don't appear on the spectrogram. So you have to listen in real time while you're doing something else, reading or something, and then you'll hear a little tap, that is not a woodpecker because it's in the middle of the night and it's just two, and then you'll hear back, and woodpeckers are doing it for a purpose, and they have repetitive, rhythm to get the grubs or whatever it is they're looking for in the tree. So So you'll hear wood knocks, you'll hear footsteps, you'll hear vocalizations, often like whoop. They'll make a whoop, kind of like a howler monkey. They'll sometimes approach the recorder and sniff at it. And you can't tell quite what animal it is, but then they'll tap it, like I think you heard on my documentary that you watched, How to See a Sasquatch. They'll tap it, pop, 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 pop. And so, that could be, you could imagine, well, is that a bird pecking at it? Well, then, but there was huge footsteps right before that, so it's not a bird. Anyway, all sorts of indications that, yes, the Sasquatch group locally has this area that you're in as part of their circuit, their territory. They're not in there every night or even every week, but they do come through. They're mobile. They keep moving around, which is part of how they're able to be elusive. They don't just sit up camp and stay there. So once you confirm that to yourself with audio, and you realize that, well, if they're around, this is probably the same people who have made these structures, because they don't look like, reasonable human structures or structures that we enjoy to make. Like lots of times there'll be this huge tree bend, like of a sapling or a little bit older tree, and it'll be bent all the way down. And that's not good enough. But if you find the end of it pinned with a rock or a log pinned down intelligently, purposefully, then you think, well, this isn't natural. And why would a person do that? And then why are there wood knocks in the middle of the night? So if it's people doing the structure building, then maybe people are out there at 2:30 in the morning knocking on trees for no good reason. Anyway, you put it all together, and it's never 100%. But you get up to 90+%. And then the next step 3, is go out there and sleep there by yourself. It's the least threatening to them to not go out with a group, but go out by yourself. So I've done that over 100 times, maybe many more than that. I lost count. And on 5 separate occasions, I've had a tree pushed down on a still night, like within 35 feet of me. And you can hear it, and you've heard it on in the documentary. You hear like crack, 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 crack. Like obviously it's being pushed against the resistance of the health of the tree. Like crack, 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 bam. And instead of freaking out, I'm always frightened at some level, but I'm more fascinated than frightened. And so I'll be elated and feel privileged. I'll say, thank you. I'm so glad you're here, and, but it's very hard, they don't let themselves be filmed hardly ever. That's why we have such a scarcity of good or persuasive footage. The Patterson film, now 57 years old, remains our most persuasive piece of Sasquatch footage, which is astonishing. Because after that was filmed, everybody who was into the subject in 1967 thought, well, now it's just a matter of a few months or, maybe a year tops, we'll duplicate this film with even better than 58 seconds, and it'll be case closed. That same kind of thinking that we had after we began to acquire thermal cameras. You just think, we're right around the corner. It's very funny. Now I'm getting old, and I may never live to see this sort of revolution of general acceptance of the reality of the species.
Some people place Sasquatch in the category of a cryptid or a shapeshifter. And you yourself suggest that there are paranormal components to Sasquatch.
Yeah, that's a huge, wonderful new vista that we're increasingly being enriched about the more we learn about this species. So, cryptid just means an animal that hasn't been verified yet. So, the lowland gorilla wasn't verified until 1902. Before that, it was in that category and other things. So, cryptid can just be a normal creature that hasn't been discovered yet, and then becomes a known part of zoology. But the paranormal aspect, like paranormal, as most of our viewers will know, just means something that is part of reality, part of nature, if you will, nature in the broad sense of the term. But the para part is that it hasn't been normalized yet in the sense of nailed down as a confirmed aspect, phenomenon in known reality. So we're paranormal creatures in that we have spirit inside of incarnated in our bodies. And when we die, the spirit, which is a higher vibration than this dense flesh, will go to the higher vibration. And that's the afterlife. At least this isn't about that, so we won't go into that, but that's my belief. So, and then we can come back as spirits, and we can become briefly dense enough to be perceived by those still in this meat suit. So we're paranormal, we're spiritual, and Sasquatch, it seems, as close kin to us, is also paranormal like we are, but they're more adept at it. They're more adept at telepathy. Hundreds and hundreds of people, probably many more than that, have experienced voices in their heads in association with Sasquatch. Voices in their heads that aren't from schizophrenia and aren't sort of habitual for this person, but all of a sudden when they're near Sasquatch and they hear knocks, and other telltale signs of Sasquatch, or they see them in the moonlight peeking out from behind a tree, they'll hear a voice in their head saying, stay away from our territory or something like that. All sorts of messages that they get. And human beings, our species can communicate telepathically, some more proficiently than others. And I think Sasquatch is just better at manifesting after death, which is why people see them sometimes appearing and disappearing, and why most native traditions have them as spirit beings, not flesh and blood. But I think they're like us, flesh and blood, and also once the flesh falls away, they're able to modulate their vibration, their frequency, in order to be seen and to interact with the physical world. On May 2nd, 3 years ago, I was walking in the woods, again, just a couple hundred yards from here, and I had never experienced sort of invisibility situation that many people claim to have. And so I've always felt envious, invisibility envy. And all of a sudden I was walking in these woods and I heard the telltale knocks, and it was broad daylight and I could see all around me, and these knocks were coming from much closer than the edge of where I could see. These were the very same wood knocks that I had recorded on many, many occasions, almost always at night. And here they were in the middle of the day, close to me, sounding exactly the same. There's no breeze that made the tree, creak in a certain way. It was like very obvious knocks, but nothing visible. So that was my inauguration, my loss of virginity ontologically, or however you want to put that. And I then was part of the club of those who have experienced non-traditional, non-physical, definitely paranormal facets of this species. There's this man named Mike Patterson in Ontario, whose YouTube channel is Sasquatch Ontario. And he's been interacting with a local group who is sometimes visible and most of the time invisible. And people hearing that are going to, many of you are going to stop watching at this point. But I tell you, I used to be in your shoes, the skeptics, even cynical, not skeptical. Cynical being more dismissive than skeptics. And until I talked to more and more people, the same woman at whose house I filmed the Woodpile Sasquatch, extremely trustworthy woman, whose sightings were, as I say, confirmed by that Woodpile footage. She was driving a car next to her friend Brenda one day, broad daylight, and a Sasquatch walked out in front of them. And in the middle of walking across the road, it disappeared. And it's not that it affected their vision or something, because the whole experience was continuous. There wasn't like a missing time or some jump cut to the next part of their perception. It was continuous, and the thing disappeared. And my friend turned to Brenda and said, "Did you just see that?" And they both saw the exact same thing. And, you can't dismiss that once you hear hundreds of extremely credible, solid people tell you this, or you read accounts in books or online. On YouTube, you hear interviews, and it snowballs. All the preponderance and the critical mass of eyewitness evidence and testimony just forces you to accept that in some way they're doing this. And some people think that the actual flesh and blood creatures are disappearing. I think it's more likely, as I said, that the ones who have passed on are more able to manifest here on this plane, just like we can, but they're more able than we are to manifest here and walk across the road and then return to their higher frequency sort of default condition where we can't see them anymore. So this sort of thing over the years has informed me, educated me to the fact that this is a primate, very close to our primate lineage, but that they are also very close to spirits, ghosts, and in fact, aliens who can also disappear and appear in the blink of an eye. And there are many, many parallels. Like Sasquatch researchers often report their electronic equipment being drained or being disrupted in the presence of these people. And some think that it's infrasound, like low-level sound that you can't hear, because people feel suddenly an influence on their chest. They'll become disoriented or filled with dread, or they'll be nauseous, or they'll be dizzy, and they have to get down on one knee. Sometimes they'll actually throw up. And this is called being zapped in the research community. But infrasound will have that effect on people. Infrasound, lions can make it. Elephants famously communicate through infrasound. But infrasound doesn't affect electronic equipment. So in some way, it's on the electromagnetic spectrum that these effects are being achieved on equipment and on our bodies. And this is a dead ringer for what aliens will do. When they come into someone's bedroom at night, they'll paralyze them. People feel this electrical sensation, this sort of sizzle in the air or on their chest. And I felt that. I felt that once in Florida, a sizzle on my chest when my friend and I came close underneath an old oak tree to a moving shadow that we thought was a Sasquatch. Suddenly we were both stopped in our tracks, and we felt this. When you feel this sensation, it's like there's no arguing with it. You're not going to say, "Well, I feel this, but let's keep going." You don't keep going. We both just backed up in kind of awe at the definitiveness of this rejection of our progress, so however you want to say that. So they can do that, as we very well know. And more people are finding out, the more that the UFO subject is becoming, more light is being shed upon it week by week, month by month. And you have Lou Elizondo's book that just came out 10 days ago or so, 16 days ago, and David Grush's testimony last year. So the reality of the UAP/alien phenomenon is gaining greater and greater acceptance and embrace by a wider swath of the general public and even scientists now. And that's kind of, in a way, stolen the spotlight from Sasquatch research, and maybe we in the Sasquatch, on the Sasquatch beat, are going to have to wait our turn. On the other hand, it may be that the increased attention to the UAP alien phenomenon will draw us along with it. The more those of us who recognize the affinities among spirits, aliens, and Sasquatch, the more we can contribute to the conversation and hopefully illuminate the sort of kinship, how all these conscious entities are, you could say, vibrational neighbors with one another, part of the umbrella phenomenon. All three have been seen at Skinwalker Ranch, for instance.
There are a lot of parallels, it sounds like, between Sasquatch and what we perceive as aliens. In fact, there's even reports of Sasquatch being at Skinwalker Ranch, for example, where there has been a lot of paranormal activity.
Yeah, that's true. Skinwalker Ranch seems to be a case study in the nexus of these different manifestations of what I think is the same source. You know, we can't yet name or delineate that source, but it seems that beyond our familiar reality frame is a larger reality frame, perhaps an infinitely large reality frame that makes incursions into our frame from time to time. And at certain places like Skinwalker Ranch, these incursions are more intense and routine and consistent, typical than elsewhere. And so that people who visit that ranch, even if they haven't had the privilege or the curse of having paranormal encounters in the past, they'll suddenly start to perceive things. And these things will include orbs, spheres of energy floating through the air, moving around as though intelligently directed. They'll see shadow figures, sort of human figures. They'll see similar figures that are hair covered, and so that's the relation with Sasquatch. They'll see UAPs streaking through the sky and moving across the land. As those of you, and I count myself among you, are huge fans of the TV series. They don't emphasize the Sasquatch connection or the cryptid connection more generally. In the book by George Knapp, Colm Kelleher, and Lakatsky, there's much called Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. There is much more detail and much more kind of equal sharing of the spotlight with other sorts of manifestations, including cryptids. Like they saw a dinosaur kind of creature. They saw, they call Bigfoot sorts of creature, and other animals such as giant wolves, like dire wolves that shape shift. And the term skinwalker, as most of you will know, it just means shapeshifter. And Sasquatch has been seen as a shapeshifter, and many of the native tribes that I mentioned before, their names for this species reflect that you can't circumscribe this creature like a normal animal, an organism that always looks the same. They can elude you by going invisible or changing into other forms. And one of the fascinating aspects of people visiting Skinwalker Ranch and Bradshaw Ranch and others like it is that even though they've never had such experiences in the past and everything intense just seems to happen once they get to Skinwalker or the other places, once they go back home, as we know, they are often recipients or victims, however you want to put it, of the hitchhiker effect, which means that they now have more and frequent encounters that are similar to what they encountered at Skinwalker. When one of the military personnel who visited Skinwalker went back home, she all of a sudden had orbs in her room. Her son one night looked out the window, and across the yard there was a wolf man or a dog man standing there, which is another cryptid that people often describe seeing. And it could be that Sasquatch shape shifts into a dog man, or that it's a separate species entirely. And they'll hear footsteps, and they'll have visitations that are just like spirit visitations that people have when they're, having hauntings or conducting seances. It all just blends in together and begins to look like the same ball of wax, if you will. And I think my sense of why that is something called resonance. So I think we all have in our consciousness / spirit, I think that these two, to me, are synonymous. We have a certain bandwidth, and that's why some people are psychic. They have a broader bandwidth to take in a higher range of frequencies. And I think that when even if you don't have, I have a very narrow bandwidth. That's why I can't do the telepathy. I've never experienced telepathy, even when I'm in close proximity with Sasquatch. But I think once you are visited by one of these higher frequency conscious agents, your bandwidth gets expanded, so that then when you go back home, you retain this expanded capacity or susceptibility. And then things that were around you already when you, in the past, are now within your range of perception. And this notion of resonance, have you ever seen a person singing, usually an opera singer, and then the wine glass will shatter? Some think that this is sort of urban legend or something, but it's true. You can look on YouTube and watch it, and you can verify that. If you don't believe YouTube, you can look at studies, and people do. If they get the right frequency of the note that matches the resonant frequency or the passive frequency of the glass or the crystal, then it will shatter. And you ask yourself, why doesn't it just vibrate? Why does it shatter? And that's because in cases of resonance, energy is added to the system. I didn't know that, and I recently learned that. Energy is added in. It's not just that there's a matchup. It's that there's an enhanced energy in the system because of a sort of mutual energetic contribution, something like that. And so the wine glass will shatter. Well, I think when someone encounters a higher frequency conscious agent or entity, their bandwidth has energy added to it. And this entails an expansion of the bandwidth. And then they're able to, as I said, be more receptive to or capable of a higher level perception. So that's my notion of the hitchhiker effect. And that's why there's this clustering that goes on with lots of different kinds of outside our familiar framework incursions, all sorts of different ones cluster together because they're of a similar, they're rooted in the same source. So it makes sense that they cluster. And also the people who perceive all of the clustered individual manifestations are able to because their bandwidth is expanding.
Can you share a little bit more about the telepathic connection with Sasquatch or any other paranormal encounters you've had or that you want to share with our viewers?
This is in one of my books, a book called Mind Speak, where I was lucky enough to gather together 20 different testimonials of people who've had a telepathic relationship with their local Sasquatch group. And you might say, come on. Well, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, which is the way that phrase actually goes. People usually shorten it. And if you are interested, you can see in that book whether you're persuaded by the extremely detailed accounts of these experiencers. Well, one of the experiencers in that book is myself. And though I haven't ever had direct telepathy from a person that I know of or a Sasquatch, the woman that I've mentioned now several times in Texas, where I filmed the Woodpile Sasquatch footage, she was in telepathic connection with a female. And the way she did that was when she first had them coming around, this group, she talked to a psychic friend of hers, and he said, you can be in touch with them mentally. And she said, how do you do that? And he said, well, I can tell that one of the members of your hairy neighbors there is named Nintaya. So all you need to do is just address her by name in your head. And so my friend was sort of afraid to do that, but the next day, just at a sort of a quiet moment, she in her head said, Nintaya? And instantly she heard, what? As though Nintaya were annoyed by being interrupted. And ever since that moment, my friend has been able to be in touch, sort of on demand with this local female Sasquatch. Well, okay, so I heard about this, but I was skeptical. I'm a good skeptic. And so I wasn't convinced. I would just sort of took it in. And then a series of things happened. The last time I visited there in 2011, and I won't share all of them because it would take 10 minutes, but the coup de grace was on the last morning. I had to leave to go back to the airport in Dallas, and she and I were sitting, my friend and I, my human friend, my Homo sapien friend, and I were sitting out in the yard, and I said, will you tell Nantaya that goodbye for me, I have to leave and go to the airport? And my friend said, okay. I told her, and I said, well, if you could ask her to make a goodbye sound for me. And my friend got this sort of faraway look in her eye as she would. And then she says to wait. And I'm thinking, oh, that'll never. And before I can even complete the thought, from like 100 feet inside the dense forest where I couldn't see anything, comes the loudest wood knock you could imagine. Just like bang against a tree. I won't even do it with my tongue because that doesn't do it justice. It's bang. And at that moment, the last sort of, like scintilla of doubt I had got swatted away. And I knew that it was true. The only other explanation would be that she had an accomplice and they were wearing, wires and earphones, whatever. And they were in touch, just on the off chance that I would ask for a sound, a goodbye sound. So telepathy is very real. People can do it. There's a lot of studies and research that I quote in my book, Mind Speak, about our species communicating mentally. And of course, with spirits, with aliens, everybody talks about how it's telepathic. That's the basic universal language, is not a language at all. It's thoughts. And the same thing is true between Sasquatch and many people at habituation sites and researchers who have this wide enough bandwidth to be able to accomplish it. So I knew that it was true. And then several years later, I got all these other testimonials together and put into that book. Over the years, too, if I can shift gears a bit, Sasquatch has this unique, almost unique, shared only with another group, double behavior profile where they avoid us like the plague, but then they also seek us like the cure, which is manifest at these habituation sites where Sasquatch want to be in touch, but never directly, always obliquely at an angle. And they'll do that by leaving gifts, by accepting gifts and leaving something in return. You can leave out a beautiful marble, and they'll bring a feather and put it in the very exact same place. There's a woman in Ohio who goes on YouTube by Snow White Bigfoot, and she has for years, 7 years now, scrupulously documented her object-mediated interaction with her local Sasquatch group. All sorts of incredible things happen. Like, just the smallest example is she'll leave 3 dice with the ones on top, and the next morning they'll all be still flush, still perfectly flush, but the 6s will be on top. Subtle little things like that. All sorts of objects that will be taken, and an object that's similar in color and or in shape will be put back that the woman Angie in Ohio, Snow White Bigfoot, has never seen before. So the notion is that her interacting Sasquatch have found at other people's houses similar objects and thinks, well, this is associated. This is like, there's a lot of similarity thinking. And then, so I'll bring this, like, she'll take a little box car, a little truck, a little box, those little metal model cars, and put a different car, but the same color or the same size.
How you describe how they tend to avoid us, but also seek us out, is part of your hypothesis that they exhibit similar behaviors of those with autism in the particular spectrum of savant.
Yeah, they have this bizarre double-sided behavior toward our species where, as I like to say, they avoid us like the plague, and yet they seek us like the cure. You know, many elusive animals like bobcats, etc., many that you can think of will just steer clear of us, but they don't also feel like gravitationally drawn toward us to interact with us. And Sasquatch, especially at habituation sites, of which there are hundreds, only a few of whom have come forward to be public, like those who shared their stories in my book, Our Life with Bigfoot. These habituation sites are proliferating all over the world, in fact. And at these places only exist because Sasquatch aren't content with just simply staying distant. They come toward the house and they'll do the sorts of things that I talked about before, but they will also communicate in more sophisticated ways, like with arranging objects. They'll change objects' locations. My friend in Texas once found her hoe hanging 50 feet up in a tree. And this woman in Ohio who goes by Snow White Bigfoot on YouTube has for 7 years been scrupulously documenting her interactions, but indirect interactions. There's this whole quality of indirect communication that happens between our species. People who know this and are interested in playing the game that Sasquatch seems to want to play will leave objects out on, say, their back porch. And this is what Snow White Bigfoot has been doing. And she has these diary entries. They're called My Bigfoot Diary. And she has over 100 entries, and each one is like 30 minutes at least. And so there's all sorts of details of the things that get left at her house, the things that are taken. Sometimes, very often, an object that she has acquired and left out will be taken, and in its place will be something similar. There's lots of times when the visitors will put, like, she has this little metallic bowl, and for a long time they would put it under the hood of her grill. It stuck on the metal of the grill, and she would take it off and put it on the railing of the porch, and the next day it would be gone, and she'd look under the hood of the grill, and sure enough, there it would be, as though this visitor was saying, no, it goes here, it goes here. And there's a certain OCD behavior to this, which is often seen in these interactions, a certain routinized, kind of structured concern with consistency. And many aspects of Sasquatch nature and behavior over the years began to seem to me to be similar to autistic nature and behavior. And without oversimplifying, I hope, or too grossly generalizing, autistic folks feel uncomfortable with directly relating to others. And making eye contact is a famous one. And many who are nonverbal, and Sasquatch seems to be largely nonverbal, except when we can get a recording of them talking among themselves. They certainly don't talk to us. They seem, from many habituation sites, the lessons learned at these sites, seem to prefer to communicate through objects. And autistic people, too, communicate best if they're nonverbal, sort of profoundly autistic, communicate with cards, with various images on them, and they can use these to convey how they're feeling, what they want to do, or what they're thinking, back and forth with their counselor or their loved one. Also, autistic people in general tend to want to structure their environment very carefully. They will either structure it mentally by memorizing, say, the entire train schedule of the United Kingdom, or an entire book. There's often photographic memory involved. And as I was talking about before, Sasquatch will make all these structures that fall into certain repeatable, predictable forms. And as many of you will know, autistic folks, especially children, but also adults, will make structures out of their objects. Like kids will line objects up, line their toys up, arrange their toys in just so. And if the parent changes it, the kid will get upset and put it back the way it's supposed to be. Sasquatch also will, I said they don't talk to us, but they do mimic. They mimic birds, they mimic animals, and they will even mimic the human voice. There's many stories that I have in our life with Bigfoot where a kid will hear her mother calling from the woods, will run out there. What, Mom, what is it? And of course her mom's back at the house and the Sasquatch is just playing with them. And autistic people too have this propensity called echolalia, where they'll repeat back things that are said, or there's delayed echolalia, where they'll repeat phrases, after later, that they've heard in a movie or they heard in snatches of conversation. There's all sorts of movements that Sasquatch make that are similar to what autistic people call stimming, or what we refer to as stimming, when a person will sway back and forth, shake their hands, sort of repetitive rhythmic behavior to soothe themselves. Sasquatch are very often seen swaying back and forth, often in the moonlight behind a tree, swaying. They'll also, this knocking on trees is, in a sense, a kind of stimming. There's lots of recordings of them where they're knocking on a tree just repeatedly, which is similar to what autistic people do. And also autistic children and adults will often be drawn to drumming and other percussions. Sasquatch is an extremely percussive species. And that's in fact how we know that, besides the fact that they don't live way out in the wilderness, like I was saying before, but come and interact with us, they also could be much less easily made, tagged as being there, or pegged, if they wouldn't knock on trees all the time. But they do. They can easily communicate, not by drumming on trees, but by making bird sounds, in a certain language that they would know, that we don't know, and we wouldn't be able to distinguish them from birds. But they knock on trees, and there's only two species that knock on trees, them and us. Something with a hand has to hit a tree like that.
And woodpeckers.
So woodpeckers will do it repeatedly.
Yeah.
When you hear the audio, there's no way there's a woodpecker. It's like bam, 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 and it echoes through the woods, So, and also many, especially autistic savants, are parallel to a lot of Sasquatch traits because they have usually a photographic memory. And if Sasquatch didn't have a photographic memory and a penchant for understanding systems and patterns, it seems they'd be much, much less able to have avoided confirmation by our race and indeed domination, because our race is very domineering and bloodthirsty, and we would have rounded them up like the Native Americans and put them in, segregated areas if they weren't so darn good at what they do. And I think that if they didn't have photographic memory and very fast processing speeds with recognizing patterns of behavior, patterns of our civilization and our ways and our movements, I don't think they would be able to exist in the negative space. Like you think of a drawing or a painting having positive space and negative space. And so our civilization is kind of like positive space, or you could call us the negative space and they're the positive space. Either way, it's this yin and yang, and they're able to, evade us and stay in our blind spots. That's a good way to say it. Stay right in our blind spots almost all the time, and in our deaf spots, unless we're onto them and we begin to record them at night and try to get snatches of footage of them. The final parallel or link between autistic savants and Sasquatch is, as is documented fascinatingly by this researcher named Diane Hennessy Powell, there's a proclivity on the part of Sasquatch savants to be psychic and to be able to do remote viewing and telepathy at a much higher consistency, or statistically higher, more often than neurotypical people. So I urge you out there, if you're interested, to look at Diane Hennessy Powell on YouTube. She has a bunch of research videos, and she's found alarming overlap between savants, autistic savants, and prodigiously psychic abilities in these same people.
She was interviewed on New Thinking Aloud, and I'll link to that interview in the upper right corner of the screen.
My hunch is that back in the day, the common ancestor between our species and the Sasquatch species was a primate that had autistic traits, savant traits, genius level traits, and that since then, when we split off from each other, we have retained some of those traits that especially are seen as a resurgence in autistic human beings, autistic Homo sapiens, that this isn't some disorder. I mean, it can come out as a disorder, of course. It can manifest as very inhibiting to a person's ability to accommodate to society, but it also can emerge as genius. And I think that autistic savants of our species are a re-emergence of the original cluster of traits that our ancestors that we share with Sasquatch had, and that in the Sasquatch line, they've evolved their own array of these same traits. But I think more of them are savants, geniuses, than we are. That's my little working theory, my pet theory.
Yeah.
I have a book called Sasquatch and Autism that you can take a look at if you're interested. And I have another book called The Sasquatch Savant Theory. And it's one thing I came up with about 9 years ago that I'm still pretty persuaded is a good way to look at it. It's not as though it's not trying to reduce our people's autistic folks to some sort of beast, and it's not trying to reduce Sasquatch to some mental illness. It's putting the emphasis on the upside of autism. There, in my book, I talk about the potential survival benefits and evolution of autism.
Maybe they don't want to be completely found. What is the advantage of us getting more evidence, or perhaps letting them be And what is it that you hope or wish to have happen with your relationship and our relationship with Sasquatch?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that if they simply wanted to stay away from us, I would agree that they don't want to be found. But it's this two-faced posture toward us where they, scrupulously avoid us, but then they seem to not be able to help being drawn toward us. There's a magnetic force between us because of kinship, our deep and ancient kinship. And I think that I want them to be accepted as real, not to be caught and imprisoned or dissected on a slab. I want our race, the human race, to know that we have brethren and sisters in this fellow human species, very close to us. But I think that they have a relationship to us sort of like a spirit guide is related to an individual person. I think that the Sasquatch race in general, at large, is like our spiritual guide. The human race's spiritual guide. And I think that a raising of consciousness, a coming to awareness of how they can show us the way to be more connected to the earth, and yet also to gain this broader bandwidth. So both more connected to the foundation of life on earth, nature, and the very ground of our physical existence and our sort of animal existence, and also higher, helping us sort of shepherding us higher in terms of frequency, in terms of spiritual bandwidth. Again, I hate to keep harping on that, but I think that it's a good metaphor for this. And I think that individual relationship with a Sasquatch or a group of them can allow this kind of expansion, and I'm trying to open myself to it over the years. And as I say, I think the more, the broader kind of spectrum or cross-section of the human race comes to understand that this is a kindred species and that they are more spiritually adept or more, they stretch farther spiritually than we do, and can be leaders for us, guides for us. I think that'll only contribute to the evolution, our spiritual and consciousness evolution as our own species. So it's like we got to hitch ourselves to their wagon or something like that, or hitch our wagon to their star in some sense, without somehow avoiding the domination of them that our lesser angels would lead us to. I think that the first person who kills a Sasquatch and hauls it in to, for the media and for science will be rich and famous. But I hope that the second person who does will go to prison, because in between there will be laws passed that make killing a Sasquatch tantamount to murdering another member of our own species. So there's a lot of adjustment and grand scale posturing that we need to do to relate fruitfully to this species and to capitalize as best we can upon what they have to teach us.
It sounds like you're suggesting that they can help elevate our consciousness, perhaps our own sense of ourselves and our connection to our spirit and also the physical, natural world.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it's two levels. And of course, so can spirits. People are in touch with their spirit guides and are in touch with the departed loved ones, et cetera, et cetera. And some people who have been abducted or who have CE5 encounters with UAPs feel that these visitors or these fellow inhabitants of Earth are similarly spiritual guides, and some feel that they're malignant forces, malign forces, and some feel that there's many different kinds of alien, quote, aliens and UAPs. But when it comes to Sasquatch, it seems to me that it's pretty much pure positive. There are reports of them being violent if their territory is encroached upon or if their children are threatened. I've heard stories about this, but in general, they don't go around killing people.
Chris, thank you so much for all that you've shared with me, with us today, and for giving us this rare glimpse into this world of Sasquatch and teaching all of us so much that we can learn from this next of kin, as you say, to ourselves. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, Emmy, I really appreciate it. And thanks for letting me go on and on like this. It's a rare opportunity. Most people I talk to, they pretend at first that they're interested, and then, as you can tell, I then go on for 25 minutes and their eyes glaze over so much that you can actually hear them glazing over. So I really appreciate this opportunity. And anyone who's trying to learn about them and wants to sort of follow my protocol of finding structures and recording their sounds and then going out into the woods and wants to sort of have some moral support or please be in touch. My website will be in the description below, and you can get in touch with me through that. And I'd be delighted to give anyone advice or to just be a sounding board for your experiences. That'd be great. So thanks to everybody who's listened to this interview today.
Great. Well, our pleasure. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.